Looks like our recording is in process. So welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us today for a Utah Historical Society Perspectives lecture. We are so excited to spend an hour thinking about Pioneer Day commemorations as we head into Pioneer Day week, which is next week. My name is Wendy Rex Atzet. I'm a public historian with the Utah Historical Society. I'm really happy to welcome my colleagues, Mark Melville, who is the assistant editor of the Utah Historical Quarterly. He has a background in Mormon studies and Utah history, and he has previously worked at BYU Studies and at the Latter-day Saint Church History Department. And his article on the history of Pioneer Day was published in the spring 2023 issue of Latter-day Saint Historical Studies. And our co-panelist is Steve Olsen. We're super happy to hear from him today. He is the Master Curator of the Church History Department at the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, where he's worked his career over 4 decades, creating museum exhibits, restoring historic sites, and leading organizational change. He has been president or board member of a variety of state, regional, and national professional service organizations, and he publishes widely in the fields of Latter-day Saint studies and museum studies. Our presenters will go start with Mark, and we'll go next to Steve. And just as a matter of protocol, since this is a webinar, I ask that you please generously use the Q&A or chat during the session, and we will take questions and answer questions at the end of the session, but ask them as they come to you, because they are always best when they're fresh on your mind. So with that introduction, I think we will turn things over to Mark.
Great, thank you, Wendy. Let me just share my screen real fast. All right, so thank you everyone for attending today. I'm going to be discussing an overview of the history of Pioneer Day from its beginning in 1849 up to the present day. So the first celebration of July 24th was in 1849. It was commemorating the arrival of Brigham Young's Vanguard Company of Pioneers into the Salt Lake Valley from July 21st to July 24th, 1847. So for this celebration day, the residents of Salt Lake City awoke to the sound of a cannon firing, and then there was a band that played martial music. At 7:30, they raised a 65-foot long national flag, and there was a procession, we would call it a parade, that led Latter-day Saint Church leaders and spectators to the Bowery in Salt Lake City, which is a public open-air structure. This procession included 24 young men carrying copies of the Declaration of Independence and the United States Constitution, 24 young women carrying copies of the Bible and the Book of Mormon, and 24 silver grays who were older men. Once everyone gathered at the Bowery, they listened to music and speeches about the Declaration of Independence and the persecution of the Latter-day Saints. After the program, they had a massive dinner. So it included thousands of Latter-day Saints, but this was also 1849, the California Gold Rush, and there were many men on their way to California, and they joined in the feast as well, as did dozens of Native Americans. After dinner, they had 24 toasts, and then they had more music and more speeches, and then eventually everyone went home, and that was the birth of this holiday. But this holiday did not spring up out of nothing. It was identical in most respects to 4th of July celebrations of the 19th century. Having the cannon fire in the morning, having the procession, including the groups of young men and young women, having political and patriotic speeches, reading the Declaration of Independence, having the toasts, and then this big community meal. That was all very typical of 19th century American 4th of July celebrations. And in 1849, the Mormon settlers in Salt Lake City did not celebrate the 4th of July. And some of the speeches that day complained about the way they felt that the United States had treated them. They loved the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, but they thought that government officials hadn't lived up to those ideals. And so you consider the content of those speeches, it's easy to think, oh, they decided not to celebrate the 4th of July. They wanted to do the 24th kind of as an affront to the United States. But it's not really that simple. So Brigham Young claimed that they had a practical reason for why they celebrated the 24th. He said, "Why do we not celebrate the 4th of July? The Declaration of Independence is just as precious to me today as it was 20 days ago. Has it not the same validity that it had in 1776? Is it not as good today as it was 20 days ago? We choose this day that we might have a little bread to set on our tables. Today we can see the bread, cucumbers, and beets that we could not have seen 20 days ago." So according to Brigham Young, they delayed their 4th of July celebration because they didn't have the food ready. Now, some historians think he was being sarcastic. I don't know whether he was being sarcastic or not, but we can't just dismiss his comments outright, because after 1849, beginning in the early 1850s, Mormon settlers in Salt Lake City enthusiastically celebrated both the 4th and the 24th of July. And additionally, in 1849, Latter-day Saints who are still in Iowa, who hadn't come to Utah yet, they did celebrate the 4th that year. And Utah was a territory, which meant that the United States government appointed their governors and other territorial leaders. They didn't get to elect their own. Now, on the screen here, I have a poem that was written by Parley P. Pratt that the 24 young men and 24 young women sang that first July 24th celebration. And what strikes me about the celebration in general is how inclusive it is. So in this poem, it's very much steeped in Latter-day Saint theology and rhetoric, but they're inviting groups of different religions and ethnicities to come to Freedom's Feast. So they specifically mentioned Protestants and Catholics and Muslims and Jews and other groups that they want to join. And additionally, that they include the miners and the Native Americans at their feast is surprisingly inclusive to me. And I think that's very interesting. So after this first 1849 celebration, it becomes an annual tradition, and it's celebrated wherever Latter-day Saints gather in Utah, and even if they're on a mission or even traveling across the plains, they observe the 24th of July. Now, sometimes when I tell people that it was first celebrated in 1849, they're surprised, because there are some sources that say it was first celebrated in 1857. And I think this misconception comes from this marker by the Sons of Utah Pioneers that is at Silver Lake up in Big Cottonwood Canyon, which claims that 1857 was the first statewide celebration. Some people ignore the statewide part and think it's just the first, but even with the statewide is not quite accurate. I'm not sure what they meant by statewide, because Utah wasn't a state yet. So it couldn't have been statewide because they were still a territory. But also, if they mean it was celebrated throughout Utah, then it was already celebrated throughout Utah before 1857. In fact, 1856 looked just like 1857 for the most part. What was unique about 1857 is that while they're in Big Cottonwood Canyon, they receive official news that the United States government had sent an army, which can be known as Johnston's Army, to Utah. And this kicked off a period of time known as the Utah War. That is beyond the scope of this presentation, so I'm not going to discuss that here. But it continues to be celebrated 1850s, 1860s, and then in the 1870s, it finally receives a name. They just called it the 24th of July before that, but in the 1870s, they started to call it Pioneer Day, or Pioneers S' Day. And it becomes an official territorial holiday in 1882. there were some tensions surrounding this holiday in many ways. You have Latter-day Saint settlers celebrating it, but you also have people who are not Latter-day Saints coming to Utah, and there could be some conflicts with that. Latter-day Saints practice polygamy, and in the 1880s, you have the Edmunds Act passed, which meant that the federal government could officially begin prosecuting people who practice polygamy. And so in 1885, on the 4th of July, church buildings in Salt Lake City and the city hall flew the flag at half-mast on 4th of July because polygamists were being prosecuted and imprisoned. And so the settlers thought that was, it was really sad. And so they were mourning that they were imprisoned. And so the non-Latter-day Saints in Utah thought that it was just very treasonous and un-American to fly the flag at half-mast on the 4th of July. And so the governor of Utah at the time, Eli H. Murray, becomes convinced that the Latter-day Saints are going to be in this big rebellion against the government, and that on the 24th of July, they're going to fly the flag at half-mast again. And he just thinks this is horrible. He orders them that they can't fly the flag at half-mast on the 24th, and he gathers Civil War veterans who are volunteering to be in this army that is going to put down this rebellion that he is convinced is going to happen on the 24th. A few days before the 24th of July, he meets with some local Latter-day Saint leaders, and they convince him, no, there is no rebellion that's going to happen. Don't worry about it. But then on July 23rd, former President Ulysses S. Grant dies. And so Governor Murray orders that on July 24th, all flags in Utah have to be flown at half-mast, the very thing that he told them not to do. In 1890, Latter-day Saint Church President Wilford Woodruff issues the Manifesto, which paves the way for the end of polygamy. And therefore, in 1896, Utah finally becomes a state rather than just a territory. So 1897 is the 50-year anniversary of Brigham Young arriving into the Salt Lake Valley. And it's known as the Jubilee year. And now that Utah is a state, the Pioneer Day becomes more broadly about Utah history in general. But the Mormon pioneers still remain the central focus. And so here on the screen, I have this image of the Brigham Young Monument that is on South Temple. So in 1897, they unveiled Brigham Young. 3 years later, they unveil the rest of the monument, which includes a Native American and a mountain man. So the fact that they include this Native American and this mountain man shows that they are thinking more broadly about Utah history. But with Brigham Young at the top of the monument, that's still the centerpiece of their view of Utah's history. And 1897 was a really big year. They celebrated for 5 days. And on July 22nd, they formed the Utah State Historical Society. Again, part of this effort of thinking more broadly about Utah's history. Still continues to be a big holiday as we enter the 20th century. And it was in 1931 that it began to be more of the holiday we know today. So in 1931 was the first time they celebrated covered wagon days. Today we know that as Days of 47. They changed their name to Days of 47 in 1943. And so as part of the first covered wagon days, they dedicated the Salt Lake Airport. And so for part of these festivities, they had 10 surviving pioneers ride in a wagon across the airport, and they board an airplane that flies over Emigration Canyon. So it had taken them, when they were pioneers, it took them several days to get through Emigration Canyon, but now they could fly over it in 9 minutes. And I need to clarify here that the definition of a pioneer had shifted over the years. Originally, the definition of pioneer was only members of Brigham Young's July 1847 company. Anyone who came later was not considered a pioneer. By the late 19th century, anyone who arrived in 1847 was a pioneer, even if they came later in the year. And then early 20th century, anyone who arrived before the Transcontinental Railroad was completed in 1869 was considered to be a pioneer. So we've had to adjust our definitions of pioneers over the years. And additionally, as there were fewer surviving pioneers, it was no longer good enough to simply honor the pioneers. A lot of the rhetoric shifted that we should be like the pioneers. They were examples that we need to follow. In 1947, it marked the centennial of Brigham Young's arrival in the Salt Lake Valley. And so people who celebrated got the idea that they want to recreate Brigham Young's original company with the same amount of people. A lot of them were descendants of original pioneers, and they're going to come across the plains. But in 1940s, we have World War II going on, and there's a lot of rationing. They don't know when the war is going to end. And so they're unable to plan all the logistics to get all these wagons to transport all these people. So what they do instead, when the war ends in 1945, they still have time to plan for a smaller version of what they wanted to do. So instead of having actual wagons, they take automobiles and they put these artificial wagon covers on them to make them look like wagons, even though they aren't. So on the right here, I have this book published by the Sons of Utah Pioneers. On the cover, it shows these cars. And on the left, on the top, I have a picture from this book. It's a little grainy, unfortunately, because it is from this book. But it's these Catholic nuns in Nauvoo, Illinois, before these pioneers leave Nauvoo. They pose with these Catholic nuns, and you can see there's this one nun posing with one of the fiberglass oxen they attached to the car. She has her hands by her head like the ox's horns, and then the nun next to her is laughing. I just think this is a fantastic image. This group leaves Nauvoo, Illinois on July 15th, and they come across the plains. They stop in different communities and perform skits in the evening. On the bottom left here, I have an image of Spencer and Camilla Kimball standing on Independence Rock while all these car wagons are circled like you would circle the wagons. Also in 1947, you have the unveiling of This Is a Place monument. Today, it's surrounded by This Is a Place Heritage Park, but then it was just a monument near where they believed that Brigham Young said, "This is a place." And this monument again continues to have a broader view of Utah history, but still centers the Mormon pioneer story as the centerpiece. So on the top, there's Brigham Young with his counselors, Heber C. Kimball and Wilford Woodruff. On the bottom of the monument, you have different groups in Utah history, mountain men, the Spanish explorers of 1776, the Donner Reed party who passed through, and also it has Chief Washakie, who is a Shoshone chief, and he is the sole Native American represented on this monument. So this monument has a very Eurocentric view of Utah history. And again, we see a shifting definition of pioneers as we come later in the 20th century. Here I have a political cartoon from the Salt Lake Tribune from 1969. Has two pioneers taking a soil sample, and one says, "These surface samples show the soil here is gray, harsh, and extremely dry." And without context, you might not understand what is going on here. But 4 days earlier, on July 20th, 1969, is when the Apollo 11 astronauts landed on the moon. So 4 days later, on the 24th of July, is when the astronauts returned to Earth. And so many people saw them as modern day pioneers. So 1969 is celebrating the centennial of many things in Utah history. It's the Transcontinental Railroad and the river explorations of John Wesley Powell and mining in Utah. but people are really interested in history in the making of these new pioneers, of the astronauts. So again, we see a shift in the definition of pioneers. Not only should we try to be like the pioneers, but if you have the same qualities that the pioneers had, like courage and hard work, that meant you could also be a pioneer. Anyone could be a pioneer. Late in the 20th century, 1997 is the sesquicentennial 150th anniversary. So I'm the little kid in this picture in the front in the glasses. This is the one time I've been to the Days of 47 parade. And this was another really big year in remembering Mormon pioneers. There's a very large group that recreated the original Pioneer Trek. But unlike in 1947, where they had like a specific number, this time it was much bigger than that. And they actually used wagons and handcarts and walked the whole way. They walked from Nebraska to Salt Lake City from April to July of 1997. And this kicks off the era of Pioneer Day in the 21st century. Again, we see kind of a shift in how we think of pioneers. We see refugees and immigrants as pioneers in their own way. You also see the beginning of, in the 2000s and in the 2010s, the beginning of Pie-and-Beer Day. So people who don't necessarily see themselves in the Pioneer Day story, they can't ignore Pioneer Day, but they come up with their own alternative holiday. And that brings us into more modern times. We have seen how Pioneer Day has shifted over the years, and it will continue to shift to suit our modern tastes and our modern values. So in 1947, this is a place monument did not include three important people who were part of Brigham Young's July 1847 company. They were Park Wales, Oscar Smith, and Green Flake. These were all enslaved men who were part of Brigham Young's company, but they are not on This Is a Place monument. And so in 2022, there were new statues at This Is a Place Heritage Park near the original monument to those three men, as well as one for Jane Manning James, who is a free Black woman who arrived in later that year in 1847. So we've become more aware of who has been left out of the traditional Pioneer Day story, pioneer story, and trying to insert them into the story. Additionally, in 2022, Salt Lake City voted not to spend money on fireworks because they were worried about the air quality and the fire risk. And so that year they did a laser show instead. And then beginning last year, they opted to replace it with a drone show. So on the right here, I have an image from last year's Pioneer Day drone show. And it had a lot of different Utah symbols and imagery. And for pioneers, they use this image of a handcart pioneer, which I think is really interesting because handcarts didn't come until 1856, which was 9 years after Brigham Young's company and 7 years after the first July 24th celebration. But they've come to be one of the major symbols of Pioneer Day. They didn't really become associated with the holiday until the 1890s. But again, we've seen a shift in the definition of pioneer over the years. And so now that's one of the symbols. That does it for my part of the presentation. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen now and let Steve take his turn.
Okay, let's see if I can do this. Can you see that?
Not yet.
Well, not yet. What do I do?
There's a share icon on the bottom of the screen. There we go.
Okay. We good?
Yes.
Can you see that okay? First of all, thank you for this opportunity. Pioneer Day is one of my persistent research interests. And I'm going to give just a shameless plug for any of you who are more than casually interested in Pioneer Day, because not only Pioneer Day is one celebration, but many celebrations are very well documented in Utah's public record, not only in the newspaper accounts, but also like hundreds of photographs that exist in readily accessible repositories like the State Historical Society and the Church History Library. And so coming to understand not only Pioneer Day, but other celebrations that exist in Utah's traditions is readily available and very easily researched, and you can come to extraordinary insights into the nature of Utah culture and the culture of the Intermountain West as a result. So point number one. Point number two is I'm just going to add a few additional comments relative to the very first Pioneer Day celebration on July 24th, 1849. Mark did just a superb job in framing it up, but I'm just going to add a couple of other little pieces of information. One has to do with the timing. Mark mentioned that it was only 2 years. It was on the second anniversary of the arrival of the first company of Mormon pioneers into the Salt Lake Valley, where this celebration began. And I know of no major celebration that started within 2 years of the event that it's commemorating. It was really quite, it reflects a kind of an intentionality and self-consciousness about what the Mormons were doing in their settlement of the Great Basin. And to then celebrate it within just a few years of its actual, the initial event, shows how serious they took this and how meaningful it was for them. In addition to that, the participants, Mark mentioned that it was really quite, that first celebration was really quite inclusive of people who are not Latter-day Saint, who were in the Salt Lake Valley at the time. In addition to that, it was really quite extraordinary to know that at a given signal, all of the Latter-day Saint congregations that existed in Salt Lake City at the time came together and then marched as separate units to Temple Square, where there was a Bowery erected for the purpose on the southeast corner of Temple Square. So virtually everybody who was in Salt Lake City at the time was participated in one way or another in this celebration, which is, again, extraordinary in terms of the coverage that it had in the real inclusivity. And it really indicates how serious the Latter-day Saints were in establishing a kind of a community identity and maintaining it through various expressions. Because this was the the assemblage of Latter-day Saints of any scope in the nearly 2-decade history of the Church of Jesus Christ. And I'll talk about various social groups in just a few minutes. But the third thing I want to make particular mention of is how these celebrations, and particularly Pioneer Day, focus on a meaningful landscape. In other words, they just don't happen somewhere. They happen in particular places for particular purposes. So that first celebration focused on Temple Square. The Bowery was assembled on Temple Square. The procession went and got Brigham Young and other leaders and brought them to Temple Square. The primary focus of the event was Brigham Young's oration, and it occurred on Temple Square. And then the group adjourned to tables set up for the banquet, which was at or on Temple Square as well. So Temple Square was really the focal point of that first celebration and continued to be the primary focal point for many years to come, including up to and almost including the present day. So probably the first century and a half, Temple Square was the primary focal point of this celebration. But other parts of the city became included in the celebration as well. As Mark mentioned, and Wendy in her introduction, the meaning of Pioneer Day changes over time, and therefore the nature of the celebration shifts to reflect that changing meaning. And so, for example, while Temple Square was the primary, it was the focus of the beginning of the celebration, pretty soon other places in Salt Lake City, including Liberty Park, became included in the landscape of Temple Square, as it were. And now other places in the city have now been incorporated into the celebration as a whole, including now the park, the Utah State Park for the venue for the rodeo. Anyway, those are some of the additional comments that I would make. And now I'm just going to let's see, did that change the screen?
Yeah, you moved on to the second slide, but you're not in the presentation mode. So we just see all your slides together.
Oh my goodness. Okay, let me see what I can do here. Is that better?
It's still showing all the slides.
Is it really?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
But it works. You can proceed that way if you want to.
Okay, let's just do that rather than trying to reinforce how technically incompetent I am. This is I'm gonna focus most of my comments from here on out on the parade itself and give you some analysis of the contents of the parade as an anthropologist would, because that's the training that I have. This shows the Pioneer Day Parade in Salt Lake City of 1897. And Mark mentioned it was the largest by far of the celebrations that had existed up to that point on the Jubilee year of the arrival of the Mormon pioneers. But the celebration occurred in, I'll say, dozens, if not hundreds, of other communities throughout the Great Basin and even overseas. Everywhere where there was just a modest assemblage of Latter-day Saints, they got together on July 24th and celebrated it. And this celebration, if I can put it this way, performed several significant roles. It convinced the Latter-day Saints that they were a free people, that they were a chosen people, and that they were a blessed people. In other words, Mark had mentioned in his presentation that the analogies to July 24th or Independence Day. Well, those analogies, those similarities went way beyond just the format of the celebration itself. That the Latter-day Saints really were self-conscious about their being a free people, like Americans were independent of the oppressiveness of their colonial overlords of the British Isles for many years. Now, with the Mormons effectively outside of America, and then as part of the margins of America, they saw themselves as a free people, not only in politically free in terms of Independence Day, but also spiritually free in terms of Passover. In other words, this idea of being both politically free and religiously free was a very, very self-conscious notion that they had throughout the celebrations. In addition to that, they saw, even though July 24th wasn't the formal, July 24th wasn't when Mormonism came into existence. That was April 6th, 1830. But they saw July 24th as a kind of a renewal, a rebirth, as it were, and they celebrated that rebirth in very, very self-conscious ways, as if it were a birthday party. And then finally, as a blessed people, they the feasts were an important part of the celebrations, like feasts were of Thanksgiving Day, and it was again a very self-conscious notion that they had been blessed by God to come to this new place where they established a homeland, and they could live their religion according to their desires. But it wasn't just a celebration of them being blessed from a historical perspective. That is, they weren't just looking backwards, but they were also looking forwards. And let me read a quote by Brigham Young that reflected the notion that Pioneer Day was kind of a rehearsal for a millennial celebration as well. In other words, they were getting ready for even a greater celebration that would be had in the future to fulfill their highest religious ambitions. This is what Brigham Young said in his annual oration in 1852. Very soon we will meet in a larger congregation than this and have a celebration far superior. We will celebrate our perfect and absolute deliverance from the power of the devil. Our lives have now been spared, and we are yet upon this planet. And by we will celebrate a perfect deliverance from all the powers of earth, and we will keep our eyes set upon the mark and go forward to victory. So you can see how active the Pioneer Day celebration was to express their sense of their personal identity and their hope and their reminiscence of the past, but also their hope for the future. So after the oration in 1849, there was a large dinner that was shared by everybody who was in Salt Lake City at the time who chose to participate. Over time, that notion of an excursion or a feast diversified and included many types of meals. There was almost always a celebratory meal connected with it, but it wasn't a single meal on Temple Square. But many families got together, many people got together with neighbors and shared a meal together, a barbecue or a picnic or some other kind of outing that included a meal. And many people went to Great Salt Lake. You can see here a picture. I don't know the date of this picture, but it's very typical of the kind of outing that occurred on Pioneer Day, when they would leave the parade or leave the oration and spend the afternoon recreating in a variety of places in the city and outside of the city. Let me now talk, but with reference to the 1897 parade, let me talk about certain categories of floats that showed up time and time again. That is, there was a kind of standard format for the exposition of Latter-day Saint identity and ideology and historical consciousness as a result. And one of the kind of standard floats that appeared were floats of defining events of Mormon historical consciousness. This one happens to depict the miracle of the gulls with seagulls kind of mounted on this almost a trophy, as it were, honoring the seagulls for their miraculous intervention in stemming the tide of the Mormon crickets, the infestation of the Mormon crickets.
Hey, Steve, can I interrupt you
Yes,
quick?
please.
We are still looking at the first slide with the Pioneer Day Parade. Is that correct?
Goodness. And is that the second?
So
Oh,
it's
wait a
slide
minute.
number 2. Okay,
You
now
see it when it says Pioneer Day St. George?
yes.
Okay, let me figure out. I think I can figure out how to make this work now. Okay, so this is a gathering of residents of St. George in 1891 during Pioneer Day, and you can even that late, you can see how inclusive the celebration was, with many, many people, certainly not everybody in town, but many, many people gathering for a photograph of all things to document their participation, not only as in the celebration, but as a reflection of their commitment to the community. This is that slide showing the Pioneer Day excursion at the Great Salt Lake. Can you see that okay?
Yes.
Okay. And I'm sorry, this was the float. This was the float celebrating the seagulls in their intervention on behalf of the settlers against the infestation of the Mormon crickets. So there were other defining events, like the driving of the last spike in the Transcontinental Railroad, or the building of the first log home in Salt Lake City, or the completion of the Transcontinental Telegraph. Many other historical events that were deemed to be significant and worthy of commemoration on this big celebration. There were also a number of social groups that were commemorated regularly. And Mark, in his initial comments, identified young men and young women and children and older men and other people. Let me just indicate that in most parades in Salt Lake City, there were a series of age and gender related groups that were featured in a variety of ways, either on a float or walking down Main Street, holding banners. And these people these groupings reflected the various roles that they played in the community. For example, the young children were almost always identified as Zion's best crop. The young girls were identified in the mottos, "Virtue our mother's pride. Mothers teach us how to be great." The young ladies, that is the teenage girls, were identified with such mottos as, "The daughters of Zion rejoice in Zion's peace, and beauty soon fades, but virtue lives forever." The young men, well, you can see how important kind of stereotypical social roles were featured in these groupings of age and gender categories. And that was not only a socialization mechanism for them, but also a way of illustrating to the wider community what the expectations that they might have had in their contribution to the community. Do you see one that says symbols of identity floats? There were numerous symbols of Latter-day Saint identity. These include two of them, which are the beehive on the left, and the other one is a little bit hard to tell, but it's a float celebrating the sago lily, which was a source of nutrition and food to get the pioneers through that first winter. And now it's become the state flower. And so there were any number of symbols of cultural identity that made the Latter-day Saints feel distinctive in this celebration. There were also many floats identifying crucial businesses. And these aren't like the commercial business floats that you see in today's celebration, but they were identifying kind of essential businesses that were crucial to the Mormon sense of mission. For example, the Deseret News on the left was the vehicle of spreading the news of Mormonism on a daily and a weekly basis throughout America. And the one on the right is a float celebrating Zion's Cooperative Mercantile Institution, or ZCMI. In addition to that, there were other floats that reflected Mormon industries like silk making and sugar making and so on and so forth. But not every business or industry was included, but those that were contributing, that were seen to be contributing to this Mormon sense of identity. As Mark mentioned, there was also this stark contrast between Utah as it was before 1847, depicted in Native Americans and trappers and traders and mountain men living in virtually acultural settings. Excuse me. Then in addition to that, there were, by contrast, a lot of afterfloats, that is, floats that depicted what Utah had become as a result of the Mormon settlement in Utah, and most of these were reflecting various counties. So, for example, the one on the far left shows Davis County and all of the production of flour mills, the flour of various kinds. The one in the middle on the top represents Iron County and the production of the iron works that were down there. The one on the bottom has making of cheese in Sevier County. And then the other two show the cornucopia of garden produce, of vegetables and fruits from personal and commercial gardens. And then finally, the one on the lower right shows the production of wheat and other grains. I think that's a Sanpete County float. All these are from the 1897 parade. And then finally, occasionally there were humorous floats, and this shows a humorous float of children gathering together, young children gathering together, being kind of cute and exemplifying a nursery rhyme. But there were also floats that were a little bit more serious in their humor, because, for example, I've seen a float of young single, or not young single women, but adult single women standing on a float, and they're dressed as old maids, and because they can't represent their normal culture role as mothers in Zion. So here they are being old maids with carrying signs like that say, "Wanted men with money," or "Any old batch wanting to ride with us needs to go to," and I'll just spell the name, HELENWALK. So any old batch willing to go ride with us needs to go to hell and walk. Anyway, so even the humor of Pioneer Day served a social purpose. But these are just a few of the hundreds of really quite remarkable and insightful photographs of Pioneer Day celebrations, not only the parade, but the other kind of events that went along with Pioneer Day for the time. I better end, and let's get on with the Q&A, because I'm sure that there's some really good questions in the group.
Thanks, Steve and Mark. We have one question in the group, and I'll invite everyone else who has a question to type it in to the Q&A box. So Mary Ann Kirk asks or comments, I think that there was a large feast on October 6th of 1848 as Brigham Young arrived a second time from Iowa, about the same time as later groups of battalion members arrived from California. And journals note that almost 1,000 people attended this large feast. So would that be considered an even earlier celebration than the first July 24th celebration in 1849? And maybe how you
say it's a celebration, but it's not a tradition. It's a single event. It's a celebration of a single event that's worthy of celebrating. But the celebrations I think that Mark and I are talking about are really those that become traditional.
Yes, and I'll just add, there were other celebrations. I think I don't quote me on this, but I think it was August 1848. They had another harvest feast or Thanksgiving feast. So there were other celebrations going on, but this was the first July 24th celebration beginning in 1849.
Well, I would love to ask a question while other people
Uh-oh,
type in
you
there.
ask hard questions.
Yeah. So I'm a cultural historian. I absolutely love just taking some time to think about how we make meaning and how meaning changes over time, right? And the kind of the social and cultural work that it does. And I'm so interested by the inclusiveness that you're reading into these early commemorations and celebrations, and how kind of the pioneering experience that still feels very present, I'm sure, to people in Utah at the time, is seen as something, part of something bigger, right? Including the miners, including kind of that overland trail experience, I guess. And I wonder if you see that inclusiveness of kind of the idea of the pioneer continuing to be part of this national narrative, or does it hone in more on Utah's experiences being different? That's a big question.
So to clarify, you're asking, is expanding the definition of pioneer, is that like placing the story in the broader United States story, or just still making it Utah centric?
Yeah, because I see in those earlier celebrations that they're definitely placing themselves as part of this larger national narrative. And yet, like my experience of Pioneer Day, living here my whole life, is that it's very much about what makes Utah distinct or different. So I think that's a really interesting, fascinating tension.
Yeah, you're right. Those earliest years, it was very much, we like the Declaration of Independence. And that was typical of 19th century America. Mid 19th century, they still really enjoyed thinking about the heroes of 76. And then later in the century, that they start to look more to the Pilgrim Fathers, so the Mayflower, and you see some of that in the Pioneer Day celebrations as well. So I just feel like there has been some of both. There's been placing them in the broader American story, but also what makes Utah unique.
And I would say the same thing in a slightly different way, and that is that Mormonism has always been very creative in incorporating traditional motifs from the broader culture, but giving them a particular unique twist or application within a very specific cultural context. And you see that, like, that's alive and well even today in the various celebrations, aspects of the celebration. So maybe you ought to write a paper about that, Wendy.
That would be fun. Okay, we have a couple of questions that came into the Q&A. Monique says, I am fairly new to Utah and have not been to a Pioneer Day parade. How do the floats differ now from those that Steve shared with us?
I'll say it this way. I'll just say this, this interesting reflection. So some of you might know the name Karl Malone. Well, he was recruited by the Utah Jazz to come to play for the Utah Jazz, but he didn't know anything about Utah. So he actually arrived in Utah for the first time on July 24th. And he saw this big celebration going on, and he thought that they were celebrating his arrival, not the Mormon pioneer arrival. So he learned a little bit more about that. But anyway, I would say there's still floats, there's still bands, there's still people marching up and down the parade. Those things continue to be similar. The parade route is vastly different. It doesn't start at Temple Square anymore. I think it starts at Pioneer Park and then goes to Liberty Park. And it's much more, I will say, traditional and not specifically self-consciously Mormon. So the county and municipal floats have mostly their royalty or something that they want to celebrate about their own community. But there's not a lot of kind of uniquely Mormon content to the parade, not as much as there used to be. The other thing that is new, but I think it's been discontinued, there used to be for many years a horse parade that was separate from the regular parade because, anyway, there's probably obvious reasons why that was important. But there was also a children's parade, a primary children's parade, and that was very self-consciously Latter-day Saint oriented because it was organized by the primary. But now the whole festivity, the whole celebration is organized by a private nonprofit corporation, Days of 47 Corporation or something like that. Anyway, it's not specifically church directed or church motivated. It's more of a community oriented enterprise.
Thank you for that answer. That covers it perfectly. I'll just clarify the Karl Malone story. July 24th is Karl Malone's birthday. And so his coach actually told him that the parade was being held for him and he fell for it. And so afterward, the coach was like, I can't believe you fell for that.
Oh, thank you for rescuing my misperception. It is a good story, nevertheless.
It is a good story.
It's even better. The true story is even better, like most stories are.
All right. So Licia has a question, and she said, seeing natives on the float, she wonders, were there any findings for the Yosepa group? Were they ever involved in any floats or part of the Pioneer Day celebration feasts? So Yosepa, the colony community in Native Hawaiians.
I don't recall coming across Yosepa as part of these July 24th celebrations. That doesn't mean they weren't included. I just haven't come across it. But my understanding is Yosepa had their own Pioneer Day celebration in August, so that would have been separate from the main July celebrations.
And I would say, in addition to that Polynesians are probably the single largest ethnic group besides Europeans that still have a presence in Pioneer Day celebrations. So whether or not they were explicitly part of a historical celebration, that their role, the role of Polynesians in Utah's history is really on prominent display.
So Scott has a question. What part of the past Pioneer Day traditions, presentation, or part of the parade would you like to be brought back to our present celebration?
This might be kind of silly, but in late 19th, early 20th century, Steve talked about they showed Utah as it was then and Utah as it was now. And so as part of Utah as it was then, they liked to decorate with sagebrush and sunflowers. And like they even saying that I came across an op-ed in the Deseret News saying that those things should be symbols of Pioneer Day. And in Utah, July is when all our sunflowers start to bloom. And I would love to see us incorporate more sunflower imagery into our celebrations. Even thinking of like making food with sunflower seeds and sunflower butter. I just like sunflowers.
And I'll just add this, and it's a very personal note. My favorite part of historical Pioneer Day parades was the banners that they were decorating. They would commission leading artists of the time to paint silk banners, and they would be very creative. And the Church History Museum has a pretty good collection of those banners, and I would like to see more intentionality in the expression in artistic ways of the values that are being featured.
Kevin's question is, have Native Americans had a presence in the parades? And if so, has their representation changed over time?
Yeah, so very early on in the 1850s, they did include Native Americans in their processions, and a lot of it was we view it as very problematic today, in the sense, so Latter-day Saint theology viewed Native Americans as Lamanites, descendants of the peoples of the Book of Mormon, who had a divine heritage and a divine role, but they had fallen. And so some of the banners that they carried related to this image, or this idea of Native Americans as Lamanites, who were coming back to from their fallen state. And again, it's unique for 19th century America, but it's still problematic for how we see it today. And in more modern times, 20th, 21st century, I think there's been more efforts at including Native Americans in more respectful ways. And every year since the 1990s, there's been a powwow at Liberty Park on July 24th. They clarified they're not affiliated with Pioneer Day, with Pioneer celebrations, but it still takes place on July 24th.
Okay, well, it's 1:03. I know people have other things they need to get on to with their day, but I just want to thank Steve and Mark so much for joining us today. I always wonder about these commemorations and the very clear history that they have perpetuating themselves. And this was just really informative and has given me a lot to think about. So thank you. We will hopefully be sharing this recording out on our YouTube channel in a month or so.
Thank you, Wendy.
Thanks.